You know what's wild? Last week, a crow in my neighborhood tried to land on a power line, missed, and tumbled through the air before catching itself. And I watched it hover there for a full 10 seconds, just staring at that power line like it had personally betrayed it. Now here's the question that's been eating at me ever since. Did that crow feel regret? Or was it just processing data like a broken calculator? Because if animals can actually feel regret, if they can learn from their mistakes the way we do, that changes everything about how we understand consciousness itself. And spoiler alert, the answer is way more complicated and way more fascinating than you probably think. Let's start with something simple. Your pet dog knocks over a vase. You come home, see the damage, and your dog tucks its tail and slinks away. That's regret, right? That's definitely regret. Except, maybe it's not. And that's where this gets interesting. What we call a guilty dog might actually just be a dog reading your angry face and responding to your tone of voice. Dogs are insanely good at reading human emotions. They've had thousands of years to get really good at it. So when you walk in angry and your dog cowers, it's not thinking, oh no, I shouldn't have knocked over the vase. It's thinking, oh no, the big human is angry and they're about to do something unpredictable. That's fear-based behavior, not actual regret. But here's where it gets complicated. Because while that might explain household pets, it doesn't explain what happens in the wild. And wild animals are where the real evidence starts showing up. Take octopuses. These things have 9 brains, 1 central brain and 1 in each arm. They're problem solvers in a way that honestly feels alien. Scientists have watched octopuses try to open a jar, fail, try again with a slightly different technique, fail again, then completely change their approach. That's not random trial and error. That's learning from a mistake. That's the octopus going, okay, that way didn't work, so I'm going to try something else. And they don't need to be punished or rewarded. They just adjust. They learn. And there's actual evidence that octopuses can remember these lessons for months afterward. So did that octopus feel regret? Maybe not in the way you feel regret, but did it learn from its mistake? Absolutely. Now jump to primates, because this is where things get almost uncomfortably relatable. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute watched chimpanzees play a trading game. The chimps were offered choices. Trade a small reward now for a bigger reward later, or just take the small reward immediately. Sound familiar? When the chimps made the immediate trade and then watched another chimp get the bigger reward, they showed signs of frustration and agitation. They were literally upset with themselves for making the wrong choice. And here's the kicker. They changed their behavior next time. They became more willing to wait. They literally learned from their mistake because they experienced negative emotion about it. That's regret. That's definitely regret. But let's push even further, because what about birds? Ravens and crows have been shown to hold grudges. If a crow sees you capture one of its friends, it'll remember your face for years. It'll teach other crows to recognize you. It'll dive bomb you from trees. That's not just learning. That's emotional memory. That's the crow saying, I made a mistake trusting this human, and I'm never making that mistake again. And the crazy part, the evidence suggests that crows might actually feel something like regret about their own mistakes too. Researchers gave crows a choice between a safe option and a risky option. When the risky option didn't pay off, the crows made a specific call, a call that researchers think actually indicates frustration or regret. And then, crucially, they avoided that risky option in the future. The call wasn't just a sound. It was connected to learning. It was connected to behavior change. So what's actually happening in the brain when an animal learns from a mistake? This is where neuroscience gets really interesting. In humans, when we experience regret, something very specific happens in our prefrontal cortex. There's a region called the medial prefrontal cortex that lights up. It's involved in self-reflection. It's involved in comparing what we expected to happen with what actually happened. And here's the thing. Other animals have analogous brain structures. Primates have them. Birds have them. Even rats have versions of them. So when a rat learns that going down a certain tunnel leads to a shock, and then avoids that tunnel next time, the same basic neurological process is happening. The rat's brain is comparing expectation with reality, finding a mismatch and using that information to guide future behavior. But, and this is important, does that mean the rat consciously feels regret? That's the question that might not have a definitive answer. Because regret in humans isn't just about learning, it's about the feeling of it. It's about that gut punch sensation when you realize you've made a mistake. It's emotional, it's qualitative, it's subjective, and subjective experience in animals is nearly impossible to measure scientifically. We can measure behavior, we can measure brain activity, but we can't directly measure what something feels like from the inside, especially when the inside belongs to an animal that can't tell us. This is called the problem of other minds, and it's been driving philosophers crazy for centuries. You can't be absolutely certain that any other being has genuine subjective experience. You experience your own consciousness directly, but everyone else, human or animal, is kind of a black box. You infer their consciousness based on their behavior and similar biology, but you can never actually know for certain what they're experiencing. That said, here's what we do know. Animals demonstrably learn from mistakes. That's not speculation, that's proven. The question is just about the qualitative aspect. Does a dog learning not to touch a hot stove involve a feeling of regret? Or is it just pure conditioning? And honestly, the more research we do, the more it seems like there might be a spectrum. Some animals might genuinely feel something regret-like. Others might just update their behavioral patterns without any emotional dimension. And for some, it might be somewhere in between. Take bees. Bees make mistakes. A bee might visit a flower that's been depleted of nectar, and it will learn not to visit that flower again. Scientists can actually watch this happen. The bee will try that flower, find nothing, and then show a marked preference for new flowers next time. Is the bee feeling regret? Honestly, almost certainly not. Bees have about 1 million neurons. Humans have about 86 billion. The computational capacity just isn't there for complex emotional states. But the bee is still learning from its mistake. It's still updating its behavior based on past experience. So maybe regret isn't a prerequisite for learning. But then there are elephants. Elephants have brains that are actually similar in size to human brains. They're incredibly intelligent. They have long-term memory. They remember places they've been decades ago. They remember individuals, both human and animal, that they've encountered. And there's anecdotal evidence, and I emphasize anecdotal because rigorous studies are hard to do with elephants, that they might experience something like grief and regret. There are stories of elephants returning to the bones of deceased family members, seemingly mourning them. There are stories of elephants making new attempts at solving a problem after failure, with what observers describe as determination or frustration. But these are stories, not peer-reviewed science. Here's what makes this all so tricky. Learning from mistakes exists on a spectrum, and so does emotional capacity. At one end, you have simple organisms like sea slugs, which show associative learning. They learn that a stimulus means pain and they withdraw from it next time. That's learning. But it's not really learning from a mistake in the sense we usually mean. At the other end, you have primates and elephants and dolphins, animals with prefrontal cortices and complex social structures, and demonstrated self-awareness. These animals probably do experience something regret-like. They make choices, evaluate outcomes, and adjust future behavior based on those evaluations. And when things go wrong, they likely experience something that resembles frustration or disappointment. So here's a question that might actually be answerable. Can animals learn from other animals' mistakes? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Primates do this all the time. A young chimp will watch an older chimp fail to get food from a puzzle box, and then the young chimp will try a different approach. Ravens have been shown to learn from watching other ravens make mistakes. They observe another bird trying to access food in a certain way, see that it doesn't work, and when they later encounter the same challenge, they use a different strategy. This is social learning, and it's more advanced than just learning from your own mistakes. It requires observing someone else, understanding their failure, inferring the cause, and adjusting your behavior accordingly. That's genuinely sophisticated cognition. But here's something that might actually demonstrate regret most clearly. Punishment of rule breaking. Some animals seem to actively punish others who make mistakes. Capuchin monkeys have been observed doing this. If a young monkey makes an aggressive mistake, attacks a higher-ranking individual inappropriately, other monkeys will punish it. Not severely, but enough to discourage the behavior. And the young monkey will modify its behavior to avoid future punishment. Is the monkey feeling regret or just fear of punishment? Probably a mix of both. But the fact that they adjust behavior prospectively, that they seem to plan their actions differently after being punished, suggests something more complex than pure conditioning is happening. Dolphins are another fascinating case study. Dolphins are incredibly smart. They have self-awareness, they can recognize themselves in mirrors, which is a pretty high bar for consciousness. They have complex social structures. They seem to play. And there's research suggesting that dolphins might actually have a sense of fairness and might experience something like regret when they violate it. In captive settings, dolphins have been observed becoming frustrated when they perceive unfair treatment. They'll stop cooperating with trainers who've been inconsistent or punishing. They seem to remember who treated them fairly and who didn't. Again, this isn't definitive proof of regret, but it's suggestive. Now let's talk about something weird. Do animals learn from mistakes they observe in nature? Like, if a bird watches another bird fly into a window and die, does it learn not to do that? The evidence is mixed. Some birds do seem to avoid areas where window strikes have occurred, but it's unclear whether they're learning from the mistake they observed or just responding to the presence of the dead bird as a danger signal. They might not actually be understanding the causal connection. Here's a really interesting experiment that demonstrates learning from mistakes. Researchers taught pigeons to peck at images on a screen. Different images had different patterns. The pigeons had to learn which patterns meant peck this, and which meant don't peck this. And pigeons can learn this. But here's the crucial part. When pigeons make mistakes, they show different behavior than when they succeed. After a mistake, pigeons are more cautious. They're slower to respond. They double-check themselves, in a sense. That's not just conditioning. That's error-based learning. That's updating your confidence based on feedback. That's something that resembles regret in how it affects decision-making. And if we're talking about the animal kingdom's greatest learners from mistakes, we have to talk about apes. Bonobos specifically have been shown to learn from mistakes in ways that are just unsettling in how human-like they are. They'll make a social misstep. Maybe they're too aggressive or they violate a group norm. And then they'll spend time repairing the relationship. They'll groom the offended individual. They'll share food. They seem to be actually trying to make amends. That requires not just learning that you made a mistake, but understanding that the mistake caused harm. Understanding that the other individual is upset, and trying to repair the damage. That's regret plus empathy plus forward planning. That's seriously complex cognition. But here's something we can't ignore. There's a huge difference between animals in labs and animals in nature. In labs, animals are often rewarded or punished explicitly for their actions. That teaches them to associate behaviors with outcomes. In nature, the learning is messier. A mistake might kill you immediately, in which case there's no opportunity to learn from it. Or a mistake might have delayed consequences that are hard to connect to the original action. So the question of whether animals in nature feel regret about their mistakes might be very different from whether animals in labs show learning patterns that suggest regret. There's also the question of whether regret even requires conscious awareness. Humans sometimes learn from mistakes without consciously feeling regret. Your body learns that touching the stove is bad without you having to consciously experience regret every single time. Much of our learning is automatic and subconscious. So maybe the question isn't really, do animals feel regret, but rather, do animals have the neural substrate to support the conscious experience of regret? And the honest answer is, we don't know yet. The technology to measure subjective experience in animals just doesn't exist yet. What we do know for certain is this. Animals learn. They learn from their own mistakes. They learn from observing other animals' mistakes. Some animals show behavioral patterns after making mistakes that suggest something resembling regret is happening. Many animals have brain structures similar to those involved in regret in humans. And some animals, particularly the cognitively advanced ones like primates, dolphins, elephants, and corvids, show evidence of complex emotional and social responses that could plausibly include regret or something very much like it. But here's the thing that actually matters for how we should treat animals. Even if we can't prove that an animal feels regret in exactly the way we do, we have overwhelming evidence that they learn from their mistakes. And they learn best through positive reinforcement and positive punishment. That is, rewarding good behavior and withholding rewards for bad behavior. Not through harsh punishment. Harsh punishment causes pain, stress, and fear, but it doesn't teach as effectively as positive methods. And if an animal is learning from its mistakes, then the learning process itself matters. An animal that's learned through trauma has learned through trauma. And you can see the effects in their behavior. This connects to how we should train animals, how we should manage them in captivity, and how we should think about their welfare. If a horse makes a mistake during training and we respond with physical punishment, that horse isn't just learning that the behavior is wrong. It's learning to fear the trainer, to expect pain, possibly to become aggressive or avoidant. But if we respond to the same mistake with patient correction and positive reinforcement of the right behavior, the horse learns more effectively and without developing fear-based trauma responses. So whether or not animals consciously feel regret might be philosophically interesting, but practically speaking, it's beside the point. What matters is that they learn. And they're sentient enough to suffer, and they're intelligent enough to benefit from training methods that acknowledge their capacity to learn and their desire to avoid negative experiences. There's one more fascinating angle to this. Can animals regret not learning when they had the chance? Like, can an animal look back and think, I wish I'd learned how to do this when I had the opportunity? This seems to require a level of abstract thinking that probably only the most intelligent animals can do. But some evidence suggests it might happen. Captive animals who've had enrichment in the past and then have it removed sometimes show signs of depression. Is that regret about lost opportunity, or just frustration about changed circumstances? Hard to say, but it suggests something more complex than simple conditioned responses. The deepest question here is whether regret even makes sense for animals the way it makes sense for humans. Humans are unique in our ability to engage in counterfactual thinking, to imagine alternative versions of past events and hypothesize how they would have played out differently. I wish I'd studied harder. I should have taken that job. I would have been happier if I'd made a different choice. These thoughts require not just learning from mistakes, but actively simulating alternative timelines. That's a level of temporal and abstract cognition that probably isn't accessible to most animals. Though interestingly, some research on great apes suggests they might be capable of some version of this. They seem to understand concepts like, if I do X, then Y happens, which is a form of counterfactual thinking. It's not as sophisticated as human regret, but it's something, and it might be enough to constitute a kind of animal regret, a sense that a different choice would have led to a better outcome. So what's the final answer to our original question? Can animals feel regret and learn from mistakes? The evidence says some animals definitely. They learn from mistakes. That's proven. Whether they feel regret while doing so is harder to answer, but the evidence suggests that at least some intelligent animals probably do experience something regret-like. Other animals might learn without feeling anything at all, and a third group might fall somewhere in between, showing behavioral patterns consistent with regret-like processing without necessarily having conscious access to that processing. But here's what I find most fascinating. It doesn't really matter where the line is between animals that feel regret and animals that don't. What matters is that learning from mistakes is a fundamental property of life itself. It's how we adapt, it's how we survive, it's how we get better. And whether that learning involves conscious regret or not, the fact that animals, nearly all animals, are capable of it, tells us something profound about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. It tells us that learning and adaptation don't require philosophy or self-reflection. They just require nervous systems sensitive enough to detect when something goes wrong and flexible enough to adjust future behavior accordingly. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real story here. Not whether animals feel regret like we do, but how remarkably effective learning from mistakes is as a strategy, whether or not it feels like anything at all. That crow that tumbled off the power line, it probably won't make that mistake again. Not because it consciously felt regret, but because something in its brain registered the failure and adjusted the flight plan. And that, in a way, is even more remarkable than regret. That's just the universe, in the form of a crow, learning to be a better crow.